the vote share, if I'm roughly right, and it's below 40%, it'll look very odd that you have a landslide victory in seats, and you can't call it a landslide victory in votes if more than 60% of the voters choose a party other than Labour.
Politicians pretend to think the polls don't matter, but the fact that they do indeed make a difference can be seen in almost everything they do. Look at how in a speech today Rishi Sunak is trying to persuade Reform voters to come back to the Conservatives. His argument is that they should do that to prevent a big Labour majority. That could only happen because he's reading the polls and wants the public to act on them. But what are the polls really telling us? The pollster's pollster, our favourite pollster, is the former president of YouGov, Peter Kellner, who joins us now. Good morning to you, Peter.
Morning, Stig.
What do you make of the polls' position as they are now? Are they what you'd expect in terms of the variation? Are they pointing in the same direction or similar directions, do you feel?
Broadly, but there are some differences. Over the last week or so, you've had Labour leads ranging from 15% to 25%. That's a big range. I mean, both point to a big Labour victory. But the main difference is that there's a cluster of polls which consistently report Labour leads of below 20%. And they're the ones that try and work out what the don't-knows are going to do. And they say they'll probably go back, many of them, to the Tories. And then the other cluster of polls where the leads are consistently above 20%, and they don't do anything with the don't-knows. They leave them out. And many of the don't-knows are people who voted Conservative last time. That's why they have bigger leads.
Do you think that's what Rishi Sunak's playing for, this idea that his speech today will be against the idea of a supermajority because there are these people who might be persuaded to vote Tory simply because they feel a really big Labour majority would be dangerous?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Whether it's effective or not is another matter, but it makes a lot of sense because if you look, for example, at people who voted Leave in the Brexit referendum 8 years ago, more of them are now say they're going to vote for Reform than vote for the Conservatives. And the Conservatives relied on that block in Boris Johnson's big victory to give him that 80-seat majority. And the great majority of these Reform voters live in seats where Reform doesn't have a ghostly chance of winning. And therefore, mathematically, Sunak is right to say every vote that goes to Reform rather than Conservatives in hundreds of seats around Britain helps Labour get a bigger majority.
Let's talk about your predictions because it's so interesting that we've had a variation in these MRP polls which go really from the Tories winning 50 seats to the Tories winning more than 150. And as you've said, there are the varieties in the vote share as well. Based on what you've just been talking about, how some of the don't-knows might tilt in one direction or another, what are you saying, Peter? What is your prediction?
My best guess, and I emphasise the word guess, if any of your listeners go out to the bookies on the basis of what I'm about to say, on their heads be it, okay? But I think that the Conservatives will pick up some of these Reform inclined voters and some don't-knows, and will close the gap a bit. And I think Labour may have trouble getting out the under-30s. The polls tell us are overwhelmingly Labour and hate the Conservatives. And if many of them stay at home, that could also shrink Labour's vote. So my best guess at the moment is I'm saying Labour 37% on Thursday night, the Conservatives 24%. That's a 13-point lead, lower than any of the current polls. The same lead as Tony Blair got when he won the 1997 election. And I think Labour will get something like 400 seats. But my Conservative figure is at the top end of recent ranges. I'm saying around 155. That's still a terrible figure. This is the top end of what MRP and other pollsters have been saying over the last week or two.
So what you're saying, Peter, really is that's basically just worse than the 97 outcome for the Tories. So worse than 97, but not catastrophically worse than 97.
That's right. Yeah. But the curious thing about this is that in parliamentary terms, this is a landslide. This is a gold-plated mandate in the House of Commons. But the vote share, if I'm roughly right, and it's below 40%, it'll look very odd that you have a landslide victory in seats. And you can't call it a landslide victory in votes if more than 60% of the voters choose a party other than Labour.
And that should be a historic low, wouldn't it? If you have 37 plus 24 for the two main parties, that's very low a vote of confidence in the two main parties, isn't it?
It's the lowest ever. In I think 2010 it was 67%. You add them together, Tories 37, Labour 30. 67% is the lowest two-party total we've ever had. But we've had sorts of bits of clues of fracturing of British politics. If you remember that rather bizarre the European elections we had in 2019, where we elected MEPs only for a few months because of leaving the EU. In that election, it was a proportional election, it was a second-order election, and the Conservatives and Labour together got less than a quarter of the total vote. So there has been a long-term fracturing of the two-party dominance of British politics, but in terms of general elections, this will be the lowest combined Labour-Tory figure.
Does it matter that, so say Keir Starmer gets 400 seats, a stonking majority, 150, that is the biggest swing by 1 billion miles ever to happen in British politics, bearing in mind what happened in the 2019 election. To go from an 80 Tory majority to a Labour majority of 150 has never, ever happened before. But that vote share would be less than Jeremy Corbyn had, wouldn't it? So he would not be a popular leader in the country.
No, that's right. Look, I like many people, possibly you, Stig, 3 or 4 years ago, was that we're using the image Labour has a mountain to climb.
Yeah.
And we rather doubted that it would climb it in one go. Well, what has happened is not that Labour has done amazingly well. The mountain has shrunk. The summit is not as far away as we thought it was 3 or 4 years ago. And that's why Labour is going to do so well on, as you say, more than Jeremy Corbyn got in 2019, but less than Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party got in 2017. It will be very odd. What the long-term consequences are, I think it will revive the debate about whether our election system is the right one. Now, a Labour government with a big majority is not going to do anything about it.
No.
But if you look 5 or 10 years down the track, perhaps a messier election result, and then you might get much bigger arguments about whether our election system should change.
And this finally, the question then is, in that situation, does reform start to look a bit like National Rally in France, where there is some desire, where people have turned on the Tories a bit? They feel that they're not excited about Labour. There is this type of protest party, I suppose, gets more and more traction potentially.
In theory, yes, Stig, but if you look at the trajectory of France's far right, going back to Le Pen coming second, I think 20 odd years ago, it has been a 20-year journey to get from where the far right was, where reform is now, roughly speaking, to a position where they're at the gates of power. So yes, as a long-term possibility, if the Conservatives do fall apart after this election, one can see reform gaining ground. But under our current election system, it's very hard for them to break through. Of course, if you do get a change in our voting system at the behest of the Liberals and the Greens and so on in a few years' time, then reform would certainly benefit hugely from such a change.
Your prediction as it stands at the minute is that in this next week, the people who are inclining towards reform might come home to the Tories more than is currently being predicted by some.
I wouldn't put money on it, because I think some will. I think reform will end up at around 13% as opposed to the 16, 17% they are in the polls. They'll not collapse, but they may push, enough voters might go back to the Conservatives to shrink a little bit Labour's landslide.
Really, really interesting and fascinating stuff from you, Peter, as ever. Thanks for joining us. That's Peter Kellner there, the former president of YouGov. So his prediction is a 400 seats for Labour, 155 for the Tories. That's a Labour majority of 150. It's basically 97, but with less of a popular vote for Labour